among the Bushmen, the Kalahari Bushmen, who by the way look to be the most genetically similar of all human beings to what our earliest relatives would have been who moved out of Africa. It's something like that, so that's kind of interesting. The Kalahari Bushmen are a very egalitarian society. And people like to think that egalitarian societies, because they're egalitarian, are peaceful, but that's not true at all. They're not peaceful at all, and neither is the Bushman Society. And the problem with the Bushman Society is that, let's say, I don't know, you steal my wife. Okay, well there's no hierarchy, so what am I going to do about that? There's no authority to appeal to, so I'm stuck with it. So what am I going to do? Well, often I'm just going to wait around until I get my chance, and then I'm going to take out my little bow and arrow with my poison arrow, and I'm going to nail you with it. Because what else is there? There's no authority. Now, this is what the Bushmen do, very interesting, is that there's another tribe located near them, and I think it's the Bantu, but I'm not absolutely certain, but I think it's the Bantu, and they have a hierarchical structure. So there is an authority, and so now the Bushmen will go to the Bantu to have their disputes mediated so they don't just have to shoot each other when they have an argument. So it's quite interesting, it's worth thinking about, because in a flat egalitarian society, nobody has the final word. And when everyone's getting along, that's perfectly fine, but as soon as two people aren't getting along, it's like, who do we turn to mediate this? Okay, so the Israelites had that problem in the archetypal story, and so what happens in relationship to Moses is that every time two Israelites have some squawk about whose chicken is whose, they have to come to Moses and they pour out their tale of woe, and he has to sit there and listen to it, and then he has to decide who's right. Now, so he's serving as a judge. Now, you got to think, what are you doing when you're judging? Which is a word that's, people say, well, don't judge me. It's like, really? It's like, that's the same as not thinking. Judging is actually an extraordinarily useful ability because it helps you separate out what isn't good for anything from what's valuable. It's like, it isn't absence of judgment you want, it's judicial judgment, right? Principled judgment. And then you might say, well, what is that? Well, that's a good question. You could say, well, it's all arbitrary anyways. Well, then you've just got chaos, so that's not much of a solution. Okay, so the Israelites are coming to Moses like non-stop, and he's sitting there like for years, literally for years, listening to them like 14 hours a day. And finally, he does this so long that I think it's his father-in-law who tells him he has to stop and distribute the responsibility because he's just going to get exhausted. But you could imagine what happens to you if you sit there and judge and judge and judge and judge and judge and judge and judge, is that you're building up a very articulated and differentiated representation of the moral structure that actually constitutes your society. Because imagine if you're a good judge, here's what has to happen. You two are at each other's throats, like in a really homicidal way. So things have gone too far. And so then I have to listen to you both, and I have to decide what you're going to do. But I have to do something even more spectacular than that. I have to decide it in a way that you both feel is more acceptable than killing each other. And that means you have to feel that not only is it reasonable and just, it also has to absolve you of your responsibility to seek revenge. Because that's one of the functions of law that people never think about. It's the judicial system's responsibility to take that moral burden off my shoulders. Because, what's the right response when someone you love is terribly hurt? Well, it's not, well, I'll just forget about that and go home. It's like, that's what you do if you're contemptibly weak, fundamentally. So the judicial system has to stand in for you. So anyways, the point is, if you make a judgment, the judgment won't hold unless it suits the people who are being judged. And it's not going to suit them unless it matches the implicit moral presuppositions that they're already bringing to the dispute. Now, you see this in kids. The kids will be arguing over a toy. And then they'll come to the mother or the father and they'll say, and then the mother will say, well, you do this and you do this. And if the kids don't like that, they'll go, well, that's not fair. And kids, like, they're really obsessed with fair. They want it exactly fair in an understandable way. So the parent not only has to adjudicate the dispute, but the parent has to adjudicate the dispute in a manner that the children will Except, or they'll just go back into the other room and have the fight all over again, right? Or they'll poke each other, or, you know, there'll be tit for tat revenge going on nonstop. So what that means is that the articulated representation of the solution has to match the embodied expectation of the population. So there's already a morality that's governing their interactions, they just don't know what it is. If there wasn't, they wouldn't even know when they had been wronged, right? Because you can't figure out when you're wronged unless you know when you're not wronged. So to say, well, I've been wronged, means to say, well, I don't know what's going on here, but it doesn't seem fair. And so then poor old Moses has to look at that, and he has to think about it, and he has to think, well, why is this fair, and why is it unfair, and who is right here, and then what's the solution? And the story represents him as doing that for the 10,000 hours it would take someone to become an absolute expert at doing it. Well, then the story, what the story essentially relates is the revelation of a moral code, and that's the 10 Commandments, right? You think, well, they say the 10 Commandments came from God. Well, that's fine. We kind of have an idea about God that's already stemming from the bottom picture. It's the abstract representation of what constitutes the source of authority across time. That's a perfectly reasonable way of thinking about it. And Moses, he has this bright revelation, which is like a moment of insight. Now, what happens in psychotherapy when you have a moment of insight is that you figure out what you're already doing. That's what happens, because you come to the therapist and you say, look, I had this relationship and this is how it went. Then I had this relationship and it went the same way. And I had this relationship and it went the same way. What's going on? And so then you talk about it and you talk about it and you talk about it until all of a sudden, bang! You think, here's the explanation that maps onto the behavior. And it feels like a fit, right? And that's the insight moment. It's like, I got it. And it's interesting because if you know, I do dream interpretation fairly regularly. And you think, well, that's kind of like astrology. And, that's a perfectly reasonable objection, except that it's more like literary interpretation. And you think, well, how do you know when you've got it right? And the answer is, well, it's an insight. Like, you talk about it, and all of a sudden, it sort of crystallizes, and the person goes, oh yeah, that fits. I've got it. How you figure that out, I don't really understand. I don't get it exactly. I think it's something like, when you get the map right, what happens is that there's an understanding of how that generalizes across situations, and so partly that simplifies the problem. You say, well, here's the rule, instead of having to act it out on stage. And I think the reason that would come with a burst of insight is because it's simpler and more efficient, and so your body recognizes it as an optimal solution. And I think it also opens up new possibilities for the future. And I think that gives you a dopamine kick. And so that's why the moment of insight is associated with this really potent affective marker. And that's a revelation. When you have a moment of insight, it's a revelation. People even say that. Now, we might not think anymore that it's a divine revelation, but I'll tell you, if you had a revelation of sufficient magnitude, so maybe it was one way up in your abstraction hierarchy, if you had a revelation at that level, you'd describe it as a religious experience. People do all the time. That happens to alcoholics all the time when they're recovering. They have a flash of insight, and that's when a new personality gets catalyzed. And if that happens to them, sometimes they can stop drinking. It's the best. Now, maybe this is outdated because I knew the literature 25 years ago, but I doubt it because we haven't made really any progress in treating alcoholics. Revelatory personality transformation cures alcoholism. Now, we don't necessarily know how to bring it about, but the 12-step programs try to bring it about. So, okay, so you can think about all that.